Lawrence Whitaker collapsed onto the floor of the first-class cabin, clutching his chest, his eyes vacant as a massive heart attack overtook him. Passengers screamed in panic, "Doctor, he's not breathing!" Flight attendants rushed in, chaos erupting in the narrow aisles. In seat 2B, Amara Bennett burst into tears, trembling as she clutched a worn copy of A Wrinkle in Time. "He knew my parents," she choked out. One of the flight attendants turned to her, asking gently, "Who is he?" Amara pulled out a crumpled, faded photograph. Lawrence stood beside a young couple holding a baby with eyes that mirrored her own. No one said a word. The air around them seemed to freeze, suspended midair somewhere above the clouds, as a moment of unspoken truth settled over the cabin. The wheels of Amara Bennett's plastic suitcase rattled over the glossy hardwood floor of Newark International Airport as the 12-year-old girl, thin and meticulously braided, moved quietly through the crowded terminal. Clutched in her hand was a frayed copy of A Wrinkle in Time, the only remaining keepsake from her missing father. Pinned to her coat was a ticket that read, Sterling Atlantic 405, Newark to Edinburgh, business class, seat 2B. She didn't know who had actually sent the invitation, only that it arrived exactly 1 week after her grandmother passed away, sent from a law firm in London with a name that sounded both prestigious and distant, Prescott, Lane and Whitmore, LLP. The letter simply stated that she was to travel to Scotland to receive entitlements relating to Calvin Bennett, her father. No further explanation, no confirmation call, just a business-class plane ticket tucked inside thick stationery sealed with cold red wax, as heavy and final as a summons. When she entered the business-class cabin, she was immediately stopped by a blonde flight attendant whose polite smile barely masked a flicker of doubt. "Are you sure you're not in the wrong cabin, sweetheart?" Amara handed her the ticket, her voice quiet but steady. Seat 2B. The woman let her pass, but her gaze followed Amara as if trying to make sense of her presence. Seat 2A was already occupied, a silver-haired man in a crisply ironed white shirt, a steel-toned watch on his wrist, reading the Financial Times. He didn't look up. Amara set her bag down and quietly took her seat. 5 seconds later, the newspaper lowered, and those steel-gray eyes flicked across her face, quick, cold, before turning away again. Not a word, but something in her stirred. A chill crept down her spine when she heard him mutter, almost unconsciously, "Didn't expect the air to be this small." She turned to look. He wasn't wearing headphones, wasn't on the phone, and the words weren't meant for anyone else. Amara knew who he was. Lawrence Whitaker, billionaire, founder of Sterling Global, the man who had once brought down 3 tech giants with a single divestment signature. His face had appeared on the cover of Forbes, always beside words like ruthless, cold, or emotionless financial genius. And now he was sitting right beside her. More than that, it seemed he had recognized her first. The attendants served warm towels with polished grace, but Amara could feel the glances drifting toward her from around the cabin, middle-aged men in tailored suits. One whispered, "A kid?" And another replied softly, "Probably on the wrong flight." No one said it to her face, but Amara knew that look. She had seen it in corner stores back in the rougher parts of West Newark, when security guards trailed her and her grandmother through every aisle. She was used to being seen as the one who didn't belong, even when all her papers were in order. She opened her book and pretended to read, eyes scanning every detail around her, from Lawrence's stiff posture to the way he guarded his space, not just with his body, but with an aura of frosted detachment. After a while, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photo. He stared at it for a long time, his hand trembling slightly. Then, as if realizing he'd exposed too much, he hurried to put it away. But too late. The photo slipped from his fingers, glided gently across the carpet, and stopped at Amara's feet. She bent down to pick it up, and her world tilted. It was old, the edges blurred, but she recognized it instantly. The couple in the photo were Calvin and Simone, her parents. And standing beside them, his hand resting on her father's shoulder, was a younger Lawrence Whitaker, 20 years earlier, but with eyes that hadn't changed. Amara said nothing. She didn't give the photo back. Quietly, she tucked it between the pages of her book, as though it had always belonged there. Lawrence hadn't noticed it was gone. The plane began to taxi. The pilot spoke in clipped British tones over the intercom, but Amara wasn't listening. She glanced at the man beside her. She saw her. He leaned his head back, eyes closed. Then, under his breath, He whispered just one word. "Calvin." Amara froze. Something stirred inside her. Not fear, but instinct. A sense that something was coming. The plane had barely left the ground, but she already knew. This was no ordinary journey. This was a collision course with destiny, a surfacing of truth like a shipwreck rising from the deep. And she, a black girl so often dismissed and overlooked, was holding the one piece no one in this cabin could imagine. Amara had no idea how long she'd been clutching the book, only that her palms were damp with sweat, and her heartbeat thudded wildly, out of sync with the cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. Lawrence Whitaker still had his eyes closed, but his eyelids twitched now and then, as though a storm was trapped inside him, waiting to break loose. Amara glanced at him, then down at her copy of A Wrinkle in Time, where she had hidden the old photo, slipped between the very pages where her father once scribbled in pencil. Not every door is meant to be opened, but you need to know which one you're standing in front of. Those words now glowed like a compass in a world she'd never set foot in before. A world of power, silence, and people always 3 steps ahead. She didn't yet know what Lawrence had been to her father, but instinct born from a life lived on the fringes of whispers and worry told her, "Orme." He wasn't just the man in the picture. He was a witness, or someone who let the past rot without ever speaking of it. The flight continued, time stretching like a drawn bowstring. A flight attendant delivered the meal, delicate silver trays with pumpkin soup, warm rolls, and a glass of juice. Amara thanked her but didn't touch anything. Beside her, Lawrence opened his eyes, glanced at his tray, then turned to her as if by reflex. "Not hungry?" he asked, his voice low, calm, unreadable. "I'll eat later," Amara replied softly. His eyes paused, not at her answer but her voice, as if he'd heard that tone before, a long time ago. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amara," she said, succinct. He nodded slowly, turning away but clearly thinking. A while later, as she pretended to browse the in-flight entertainment, a sharply dressed Asian man from seat 3C approached and quietly asked Lawrence something about an upcoming meeting. Their voices were hushed, but Amara caught fragments. Prescott, Edinburgh, Air. The man's name was Victor Lim, impeccably dressed, his gaze sharp. He was clearly some kind of high-level aide, not a passenger flying for leisure. Lawrence said a few words, then as Victor returned to his seat, he glanced back at Amara, this time with clear wariness. "Are you traveling alone?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." "And who invited you to Scotland?" His voice dropped, testing. Amara didn't answer right away. She looked directly at him. "Prescott, Lane, and Whitmore. The same place you're going, aren't you?" Lawrence sat in silence for a beat, then checked his watch, as if her reply had just forced him to rearrange everything. The space between them no longer felt like adult and child, but like 2 players, one of whom knew more but could no longer fully control the board. "Do you have any family in Edinburgh?" he asked next. "I don't think so," she replied, then paused. "But after today, maybe I'll need to check again." Lawrence gave a faint smile, though it never touched his eyes. Just then, the plane gave a sudden tremble. A ding sounded, and the seatbelt light blinked on. A flight attendant walked briskly by, one hand on the rail, speaking into her radio. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "We're entering a patch of light turbulence. Please remain seated and buckle your belts." Laughter died down, screens dimmed, and a hush fell over the cabin. In the quiet, Amara rested her hand on the book, feeling each breath, slow, steady, unshaken. Beside her, Lawrence reached into his inner pocket, perhaps to check on the photograph, but a moment later, his brow furrowed. He checked again, then a third time. Amara saw the shift in his face, the flicker of restrained panic that couldn't quite be hidden. He couldn't find the photo, and he knew it had gone missing recently. He looked over at her, said nothing. She looked back, didn't hide, didn't flinch, didn't confess, didn't deny. Between them hung a silence shaped like a truth neither of them had spoken. Then the plane jolted sharply. A glass tipped over, water spilling onto the carpet. A woman behind them gasped. A flight attendant rushed past with a towel. The captain's voice returned. "Moderate turbulence ahead. Please remain in your seats." Lawrence gripped the armrest, his face paling slightly, and this time he couldn't hide it. His hand moved to his chest, his brow tightened, his breathing came in jagged pulls. Amara heard him whisper almost brokenly, "Simone, don't leave me." She turned instantly. Simone was her mother. Her mother, who had died when Amara was 7. No one had said that name aloud since her grandmother passed. So why was this stranger, a powerful billionaire, whispering it in fear? Amara gripped the armrest, her heart thundering. She wanted to ask, to speak, but Lawrence's eyes had already shut. His lips moved again. I promised, Calvin, I promised I would. Then his body lurched forward. He collapsed, fast and heavy, like a wave crashing down. His breathing stuttered, then stopped, and that was when everything broke. A scream rang out. Is there a doctor? He's not breathing! A flight attendant shouted for the medical kit. A silver-haired woman from the row behind rushed forward. Mrs. Clark. Amara remembered her name from a nod earlier in the flight. I'm a nurse, she said, checking Lawrence's pulse and signaling for the defibrillator. Chaos spread like rising tidewater. Passengers leaned over their seats. Attendants scrambled. Someone cried out. In the center of it all, Amara sat frozen, her hands trembling, tears rising uncontrollably. He knew my parents. I don't know how, but he knew them, she sobbed, her voice echoing through the stunned business class cabin. A flight attendant knelt beside her, speaking gently. Is he family, sweetheart? Amara didn't respond with words. Instead, she reached into her book, pulled out the faded photograph, and held it up with shaking fingers. The image showed a younger Lawrence Whitaker standing between Calvin and Simone, his hand resting on her father's shoulder. In their arms was a baby with large, dark eyes staring straight into the camera. It was her. It was Amara. No one said a word, no one even breathed. Every sound was swallowed by a silence pulled taut as wire. And in that moment, on a flight soaring over the Atlantic, a grieving orphan opened the first door into a life she had never imagined, where truth finally surfaced, and the old engines of power began, at last, to tremble. Lawrence Whitaker was moved to the temporary medical bay at the rear of the plane after his pulse stabilized, thanks to Mrs. Clark's intervention and the AED. The flight crew announced an emergency diversion to St. John's Airport in Newfoundland for safety. Throughout it all, Amara remained still, eyes red but no longer crying. Her hand rested on the worn book, palm tracing every scratch on the faux leather cover. People moved around, passengers whispered, flight attendants stayed tense, but she no longer heard them, only the echo in her mind. Calvin, Simone, Lawrence, and the photograph still hidden in her coat pocket, like a key she alone held as the walls around her shifted. As the plane began its descent, a flight attendant approached gently. Would you like to call a family member in Canada? Amara shook her head. There's no one waiting for me. Do you have any documents we can use to contact someone? The woman asked cautiously. Slowly, Amara pulled out the letter, the envelope stamped with the red wax seal of Prescott, Lane, and Whitmore. The attendant glanced at it, eyes widening slightly, then said nothing else, just nodded and stepped away. Moments later, a man dressed like airport security approached. He wasn't there to interrogate her, he was there to escort. We were instructed to protect you until the lawyer's car arrives. You're Amara Bennett, correct? Amara nodded. Who gave that order? She asked. Lawyers in Edinburgh. They said you're the heir and everything has been arranged. From that moment, things began to change, not with grand announcements, but with nods, cautious glances, and the way everyone started addressing her as Miss Bennett instead of sweetheart. When the plane landed in St. John's, Amara disembarked through a separate corridor. A man in a suit waited, sunglasses on, holding a sign with neat handwriting. Miss Amara Bennett, PLWW, Legal Affairs. He opened the door to a black car idling on the runway, asking no questions. In the back seat was a leather binder labeled Calvin Bennett Estate, Emergency Activation, Contingency Envelope B. Before she could open it, the man in the front seat spoke, eyes forward. You should know, Mr. Whitaker wasn't just a friend of your father's. He co-founded the company with him, but later, he walked away when the company came under investigation. Investigation for what? Amara asked. We don't know the full details, but it's tied to your father's disappearance and a fire in Maryland 10 years ago. A chill crept up Amara's spine. She remembered her grandmother whispering once about a fire, about records lost in smoke, but no one ever explained. The man handed her a small envelope. Your father left this. It's only to be opened if you ever met Lawrence Whitaker, and if he reacted. Amara's hands shook. She opened it and found a handwritten note. If you find him, don't ask why. ask if he kept what was in the Geneva account until the end. She repeated the words softly. The Geneva account. The man turned to look at her for the first time, eyes sharp. What did you say? Amara shook her head. Nothing. Can you take me to the hospital? I need to speak with him. Alone. The hospital where Lawrence had been transferred was a small international facility, just 10 minutes from the airport. When Amara stepped inside, still just a 12-year-old girl in an old coat, the receptionist didn't ask who her guardian was. She was led to an isolation room where Lawrence lay recovering, a heart monitor beeping steadily beside him. He was awake, staring out the window. When he heard footsteps, he turned, and when he saw her, his eyes changed. The coldness, the calculation, it all faded. Only surrender remained. I knew this day would come, he said. Amara pulled up a chair and sat across from him, meeting his gaze. I didn't know who you were until you said my parents' names, but now I need you to answer me. The Geneva account. Did you keep it? Lawrence closed his eyes. Silence. Then he exhaled, like a man giving up a secret that cost half his soul. Some truths should never be passed on, he rasped, and some should have burned. But no, I didn't delete it. I kept it. Amara reached into her backpack and retrieved a small USB hidden inside the book's back cover, where her father had once carved a secret compartment. He left a backup, in case you betrayed him. Lawrence let out a dry, metallic laugh. Just like his father, trusted no one, not even me. And he was right not to, Amara replied, voice soft but sharp as glass. Lawrence shifted, trying to sit up, but the IV held him down. He looked at her, eyes wet but tearless. What do you want? He asked. The truth, and the rights my father left behind. Everything you're still holding. Return it to the Bennett family. Lawrence sighed heavily and turned away. Fine. There's a duplicate in my vault in London. The code is your mother's birthday. Amara wrote it down, then stood. She looked at him one last time. Thank you for not destroying it, but you should know, what I kept, I didn't keep for silence. I kept it so the world would know who my parents really were. As she stepped into the hallway, it opened wide like a new road. At the far end, the assistant was waiting with a phone call from the law firm. They want to know if you've decided to activate full trusteeship over the Sterling Global linked accounts. Amara looked out the window, where soft snow fell beyond the glass, then took the phone. Tell them yes, and transfer all Geneva account data to the legal team. Freeze all accounts associated with Lawrence Whitaker until an independent audit verifies the asset origins. Her words rang clear, and the assistant nodded as though receiving a CEO's directive. Amara Bennett, 12 years old, once dismissed in business class, was now making decisions that would shake an empire. And back in the hospital room, Lawrence Whitaker buried his face in the pillow, experiencing for the first time in his life something power had never touched: defeat. When Amara stepped out of the car in front of the Prescott, Lane and Whitmore headquarters in the heart of Edinburgh, the gray sky hung with a veil of mist like mourning cloth. Yet the air wasn't cold. There was a quietness around her, not the kind that marked an ending, but the kind that held its breath before a storm. The glass doors opened, and a group of impeccably dressed professionals approached, not to question her, but to listen. Amara was led straight into the main conference room, where a screen was already displaying the shareholder breakdown of Sterling Global tied to the trust fund Calvin Bennett had established 13 years earlier, the year he disappeared. In her hands was the original document retrieved from Lawrence's vault, complete with proof of intellectual property rights, hidden clauses, and a provision that permanently revoked representation rights if one party was found to have concealed the death of a co-founder. The truth was damning. Lawrence had not only kept secrets, he had signed a statement claiming Amara had died with her father in the fire in order to take full control of the fund and convert Calvin's legacy into private equity. Now, all of it lay exposed. Amara didn't need to speak much during the special hearing held that very day. Her evidence was enough to silence the entire table, but she still chose to speak, her voice calm and resolute, every word carefully weighed. I didn't come to fight for money, she said. I came to reclaim my parents' names from the hands of someone who exploited them. She laid on the table a certified copy of the photograph Lawrence once lost, the one where he stood beside Calvin and Simone like family, only to later use that closeness to bury the truth. The legal panel nodded after each sentence she delivered, faces drawn tight with tension. No one daring to interrupt. That same afternoon, Sterling Global issued a public statement announcing the temporary suspension of all accounts held by Lawrence Whitaker pending internal investigation, a brief line that hit the financial world like an explosion. Online forums began buzzing with leaks. A young girl, heir to a founder wrongly declared dead, had forced a shareholder emergency. The press came hunting, but Amara declined all interviews. She left the rest to her attorneys and auditors, saving her voice for the next day's public hearing, one that Lawrence would be forced to attend. He was not legally bound, but absence would mean forfeiting his right to respond before the Intergovernmental Investment Coordination Board, which was currently reviewing a multi-billion-pound strategic deal he once led. The next morning, the Royal Scottish Law Library auditorium was packed with investors, legal counsel, journalists, and even members of Sterling Global's board. At the round table, Amara sat tall in a white shirt and light gray blazer, resembling a student preparing to present, though to those in the room, she was someone who now held control. Lawrence entered last. Gone was the icy authority he had once projected on the plane. Today he wore a black hat, walked with a slight stoop, and carried a face pale with unease. He sat across from her, trying to maintain composure. The moderator invited the claimant to present. Amara raised her hand. "I'll speak." Heads turned. "My father, Calvin Bennett, didn't die in an accident. He was quietly erased from the history of a company he co-founded. My mother didn't die from the fire, but from the justice that never followed. The man across from me today once promised to protect their legacy, but instead signed a false death certificate, moved shares into his own name, and buried the data. If I weren't here today, the world would still believe Lawrence Whitaker built Sterling Global alone, and Calvin was just a forgotten shadow." Lawrence opened his mouth, but the moderator raised a hand to stop him. Amara continued, "I'm not asking for Sterling Global to be dismantled. I don't want innocent people to lose their jobs. I ask only this, that my father be officially recognized as co-founder, that all misallocated intellectual property be returned, and that Mr. Whitaker permanently resign from all executive positions." Silence followed. Lawrence rose, scanning the room for support, but no one met his eyes. He looked at Amara and asked bitterly, "You think honor can be measured by a meeting?" She gave no reply. The moderator spoke instead. "You may decline, but the board will proceed to vote based on legal filings, and allied organizations may simultaneously bring the matter to court." Lawrence swallowed. Under the sterile lighting, his hair looked almost entirely white. Wordlessly, he pulled a set of papers from his briefcase and began signing, each signature shedding another layer of his old armor. When he finished, he said nothing more, stood, and left the room like a man who no longer belonged. No applause followed, no cheers, only silence, the kind of silence that follows justice stepping into the light. The moderator confirmed the resolution would be entered into the global record. Amara bowed her head slightly in thanks. As she exited the hall, the pale winter sun cut through the windows, casting light on the brass plaque bearing the names of Sterling Global's founders, now with a single name restored, Calvin Bennett, co-founder. It was not a victory. It was restoration. Across the square, a group of school children passed by, sneaking glances at the girl with braided hair as an assistant opened her car door. They didn't know who she was, but Amara did. From this day forward, no one would ever erase her father's name again. 6 months after the hearing in Edinburgh, the name Amara Bennett was no longer a footnote beneath articles about Sterling Global's shareholding. It had become the centerpiece of a broader movement. A redefinition of honorary inheritance in the international investment world. Leading business schools began teaching her case as a prime example of ethical succession, where ownership depends not only on legality, but on responsibility for buried history. Over 100 companies across Europe and North America announced transparency reviews of their founders' records, and many amended documents, restoring names that had once been erased due to race, gender, or simply because the rightful individuals hadn't lived long enough to demand justice. Amara rarely appeared in the media. She chose a quiet, nearly invisible approach, steering clear of praise and headlines. Yet her presence, whether through archived speeches or quoted lines, came to symbolize something deeper than legal triumph. She never walked alone anymore, At every appearance, she was accompanied by representatives from educational initiatives in overlooked communities, by students whose only inheritance was intellect and resolve. The Calvin and Simone Foundation was established in Baltimore, funded by a portion of the redistributed dividends from Sterling, a sum Amara could have kept, but instead redirected to the neighborhood where her parents had lived, where she had once been told she didn't belong in first class. The foundation bore no glamorous logo and hosted no flashy campaigns. It served one simple purpose: to offer scholarships to Black students with academic passion but limited opportunity due to bias. Mrs. Clark, the woman who had helped stabilize Lawrence Whitaker's heartbeat on that flight, became the foundation's honorary advisor, sending Amara handwritten letters each month about new students and their stories of resilience. In one letter, she wrote, "You didn't just save your parents' names, Amara. You restored faith to a generation that feared their voices would remain stuck in the back row." Sterling Global, after the crisis, didn't collapse. It rebuilt in a different direction, away from publicity, toward a model others quietly began to emulate. The new board aligned executive privileges with a multi-layered legacy index, a metric not measured by revenue, but by structural fairness, ancestral acknowledgement, and contribution back to community. That system is now informally called the Bennett Scale, named after the 12-year-old girl who altered the course of an empire with a single photograph and one question. The Geneva account. Did you keep it? At her former high school in Newark, the wall behind the library was repainted with a mural of Amara reading beneath a tree, surrounded by memory fragments shaped like glowing lanterns. At the bottom, one line was written, "Don't let anyone rewrite your name just because you're not there to correct it." No one had invited her, but one autumn morning, she appeared, wearing a light gray coat, holding a cup of hot cocoa, and stood silently before the mural for almost 30 minutes. A 10th grade student saw her, hesitated, then stepped forward with courage to ask, "How did you know when it was the right time to act?" Amara didn't respond immediately. She looked into his eyes and said softly but precisely, "When silence starts to feel like complicity, that's when." That day, she gave no speech, cut no ribbon, signed nothing. But teachers later said that after her visit, enrollment in the Family History Research Club tripled. In a high-rise office in Edinburgh, the law firm Prescott, Lane and Whitmore unveiled a new exhibition space displaying the files amended in the past 6 months, each enclosed in glass with the name of a once-forgotten founder and the date of their reinstatement. Amara refused to have her photo displayed, but in the smallest corner, someone placed a worn copy of A Wrinkle in Time, faded spine, old print, a pencil mark behind the back cover that read, "Not every door should be opened, but you need to know which one you're standing in front of." It's the only item in the building without a reference code. People simply call it the door Amara chose. When spring arrived, an email was sent to all Sterling Global employees announcing the completion of the transition. In the signature line, there was no CEO's name, no branding or corporate message, only one line in lowercase, unbolded font. Power isn't who gets to speak first, it's who dares to speak last, when silence serves no one. And on that day, Amara Bennett, newly turned 13, was not in any office, nor in the headlines. She was sitting in a quiet room full of books in Baltimore, reading a letter from an 8th grade student to the Calvin and Simone Foundation, sharing how he had discovered his great-grandmother was the first designer at a software company, but had never been credited in any official record. Amara read and reread the final lines. "I'll help her rewrite it. Thank you for opening the way." And she smiled, a smile meant for no one to see, because she knew the doors she once opened no longer needed a key. The story of Amara Bennett reminds us that justice does not always come from power, but from the courage to ask questions, even when you are the smallest person in the room. In a world where history can be distorted by self-interest, the act of fiercely preserving truth and honoring those who were forgotten becomes a force powerful enough to shift entire systems. Amara did not choose revenge. She chose restoration. Without raising her voice, she used intelligence, resolve, and moral clarity to make an empire bow. She reminds us, no one is too young to stand up for what's right, no one too small to ring the bell of change. And sometimes it is those who are most underestimated who rewrite the rules, not with noise, but with unshakable quiet.